All right, we've got a lot to get through, so without further ado, I'll pass it over to Nathaniel.
Thank you, Shannon. And thank you to all of you for spending some time with us this evening. As Shannon mentioned, I'm Nathaniel Stinnett. I'm the founder and executive director of the Environmental Voter Project. And today we have an introduction to the Environmental Voter Project webinar. So this is geared towards people who are either first timers, they don't know much about the Environmental Voter Project and want to learn more, or maybe some of you have volunteered or supported our work in the past, but you want a refresher. And as a reminder, we will have a Q&A session at the end. And so if you have questions as you're going along, you can use that Q&A folder that you can find at the bottom of your Zoom screen. All right, I'm going to start by sharing my screen here. This is what you have to look forward to tonight. We're going to start by discussing the problem that we're trying to solve at the Environmental Voter Project. Any good nonprofit should be trying to solve a problem. The problem we're trying to solve, as I'll explain to you, is that there aren't enough environmental voters out there. Then we're going to get into the solution that we provide at EVP, which is to identify non-voting environmentalists and then mobilize them to vote. Then we're going to get into our proven results. We're really scientifically rigorous about proving the impact that we're having. And we want to show you how we go about doing that and the results that we and our volunteers and our donors are able to get. For how you can join our year-round work. You are here probably because you care deeply about the climate crisis, you care deeply about the democracy crisis, or both. And we are working every day, year-round, even in 2025, to try to address those problems. And then finally, as Shannon and I both said, there will be time for a Q&A session at the end. So if Shannon doesn't answer the questions that you put in the Q&A there, it might be because she's holding them for me towards the end. So let's go ahead and get started. In a nutshell, what we do at the Environmental Voter Project is we identify people who care deeply about climate and the environment, yet they aren't voting, and then we turn them into better voters. That's it. That's what we do. We find non-voting environmentalists and we turn them into better voters. So what that also means is we don't do a lot of the stuff that you might think that environmental nonprofits focus on. So for instance, we don't endorse candidates. We don't lobby for particular policies. We don't even, as strange as it might sound, we don't even try to convince people to care more about climate or the environment. In fact, we like to think of ourselves as not even being in the mind-changing or opinion-changing business at all. Instead, we are solely in the behavior-changing business. What we're trying to do is identify people who don't need their opinions changed. They are with us. They care so much about climate and the environment that it's literally their number one priority. So they don't need their minds changed, but they're not voting. And so what they need is their behavior changed. What they need is not someone to tell them how important the climate crisis is, but rather someone to get their butts out the door on election day. And we're going to start by getting into why we think this is such an important problem to try to solve. And it starts with this. There aren't enough environmental voters out there. So what you're looking at right now is a poll from about 4.5 years ago. So this is the 2020 presidential election exit poll. And you'll see 4% of actual voters in that Biden-Trump presidential election listed climate or the environment as their top priority. If we fast forward 4 years to last fall's presidential election, the numbers were a little bit better. It went up to 7%, but it was still way, way lower than we need it to be. Because When only 7%, when so few voters list climate as their top priority, three big problems arise. First, boy, does it become hard to elect good climate leaders when so few voters have climate top of mind. Second, even when we do elect good climate leaders, even when we do elect the so called right people, we all know it isn't like they can then just snap their fingers and get everything they want done, right? Just because you win an election doesn't mean that you pass every single priority of yours. No, you still need to pick and choose what to spend your political capital on, and you ain't going to spend it on the thing that only 7% of voters list as their top priority. And I promise you, yes, we're just showing you presidential exit polls, but if you look at polls of voters in any election anywhere, from city council up to president and anywhere in between, I promise you, you're going to see data like this. The simple, inconvenient truth is that there are far too few voters who prioritize climate change. Now, to be clear, there are lots of voters who would prefer government action on climate, but that doesn't mean it's a top priority. And so if you have in your minds all these polls that say a majority of Americans want politicians to act on climate, well, that's true, they do. But that doesn't mean that their vote is based on that. There's a big difference between prioritizing an issue and preferring government action on an issue. And I told you there were three problems that arise when so few voters prioritize climate and the environment. The third problem is probably the most important to get a really good holistic understanding of. And that is this: who you vote for is secret, but whether you vote or not is public record. It is public record. And so when we look at polls of voters, it's crucially important to understand that this is the only group of people who politicians actually care about. And it is the easiest thing in the world for them to look up who has a history of voting in their elections and who doesn't. And as I said, I think this is really important to drill down on. So let's just think about this. If you are involved in a campaign and you're running for office, let's say you know someone who's running for governor, the first thing they're going to do is they're going to decide, okay, with limited time and limited money, who can we afford to talk to and who do we need to not talk to? And remember, it's public record who votes in which elections and who skips those elections. So they're going to look at their public voter files and spend most of their time targeting people who have a history of voting in that gubernatorial election. And if those are the people who they're going to talk to, well, who do you think those politicians are going to poll? Likely voters, those same people with a history of voting in that election that that politician wants to win. And so what that also means is that they really don't care at all about the priorities of non-voters. And I know that sounds cynical. Believe me, I haven't been doing this for so long that I can't hear how cynical that is. But let's be honest with ourselves. I mean, if you're running for office and you literally know who has a history of voting in that election you're trying to win and who has a history of skipping that election, are you really going to care that much about the opinions of the people who skip this election you're trying to win? No. That would be like Starbucks caring about people who don't drink coffee. That would be like Ford Motor Company caring like what my 8-year-old kid thinks about cars. Like 8-year-olds don't drive cars. 8-year-olds aren't going to buy a car. And so Ford doesn't care about them. And similarly, politicians couldn't possibly care less about non-voters. And they literally know who they are by name and street address because it's public record. And this is bad news for the environment. Because every politician under the sun, whether they're running for city council in Boise, Idaho, or president of the United States, or anything in between, they know about polls like this. And not just the big presidential ones. They're probably polling in their own jurisdictions. And they ain't polling the non voters. They are polling the people who consistently show up. And when you do that, almost none of them list climate change as their top priority. And we in the climate movement are so used to beating our chests and talking about how strong we are and you better listen to us. But the truth is, we don't have nearly enough political power. And data like this shows it. We need more political power if we're ever going to be able to expect politicians to listen to us, because politicians really like winning elections. And the people who decide elections aren't the non voters, it's the voters. All right. So, why have I gone into so much detail about this one issue, the fact that so few voters list climate or the environment as their top priority? Well, because it gets to the crux of this particular problem that we're trying to solve at the Environmental Voter Project. And what made me start this organization many years ago was the realization that although there are very, very few voters who list climate and the environment as their top priority, when you look at a broader universe of people, like, say, all registered voters, so that includes some of the people who don't show up, or all Americans, well, it turns out that tens of millions of them do care deeply about climate and the environment. So much so that it's their number one priority. So why aren't they showing up in polls of actual voters like this? Well, for one pretty simple reason. They're not voting. The more we've looked into this, the more we've come to realize that the climate movement and the environmental movement don't have a persuasion problem as much as we have a turnout problem. There are tens of millions of Americans out there who don't need their minds changed. They are already with us. They care tremendously about this set of issues. They're just not voting. They're just not doing this simple, extraordinarily high leverage thing that we need them to start doing. And I'm going to get into some of the numbers that we have found here in a second. But first, I just want to prime you. I want to set the stage for why it's so important to think about it this way. And it's because we live at a moment in time when it's become extraordinarily hard to change people's opinions about anything, but especially climate change. I don't know if you've ever tried to sway a climate denier, but oh my God, I'd rather put my head through a wall. But getting someone who agrees with you already to just tweak their behavior and start voting, well, I won't claim that's easy. Of course, it's not easy, but it is easier. And it's a hell of a lot cheaper. And you can prove whether it's working or not, which we are going to do. But before I get into how we can prove that we're going to do it, I know I just made a big assertion, which is that there are tons of these environmentalists out there who aren't voting. And so let's get into some of the numbers here. When we looked at fully updated voter files after this presidential election, we at the Environmental Voter Project had really good data in the 21 states where we work. And we could use that to not only see how many environmentalists who were already registered to vote skipped the last presidential election, but we could also extrapolate off of those 21 states worth of data to all 50 states. And here's what we found. A shocking 11.2 million already registered voters. They were already registered, who cared deeply about climate and the environment, just skipped last fall's presidential election. They just stayed home. They just stayed home. And yeah, that is enormously frustrating. But as I just alluded to, it's also a huge opportunity. because this is a much easier problem to solve than if we had to change 11.2 million people's minds and get them to start caring about climate change when they don't already. No, this is an opportunity. This is a tremendous pool of potential political power. And this is why we at the Environmental Voter Project are so laser focused on finding all of these persuaded, dyed in the wool environmentalists out there who aren't even voting in the highest turnout elections we've got, which are presidential elections. And so believe me, this number is much, much bigger in midterm years or odd years. Far, far more environmentalists skip those elections. And this is a huge opportunity for us. At a moment in time, we're building political power, and addressing the climate crisis and the democracy crisis are of crucial importance. But before we get into how we go about doing this, I just want to show you one more bit of data about these non-voting environmentalists and how crucially important they are. So as I said, across all 50 states, there were 11.2 million already registered to vote super environmentalists who skipped the election. But if we narrow down into some battleground states, the picture becomes even more stark. If we look at Arizona, Georgia, Nevada, North Carolina, and Pennsylvania, so 5 out of last fall's 7 major battleground states, we don't include Michigan and Wisconsin because we weren't working in those 2 states last year, so we didn't have as good data on them. You'll see in each of these 5 battleground states, the number of already registered super environmentalists who stayed home, who did not vote, that population in every one of those states is larger than Donald Trump's margin of victory was. And in some states, like Georgia, it's absurd. I mean, almost 4 times as many environmentalists decided not to vote as voters who gave Donald Trump his margin of victory in that crucially important battleground state. This shows you how important this group of voters could be if we get them to vote. And so this is why we at the Environmental Voter Project are so laser focused, not on changing people's minds and getting them to care about climate. That's important, and I'm so glad other groups do it, but it is hard and it is expensive. And I'd much rather do the easier stuff, which is identifying people who care deeply about climate and the environment who aren't voting, and then turning them into better voters. And so this is how we do it. It's a 4-step process. Now, I'm going to go into a little bit of detail on all 4 of these steps right here on this slide. And then we're going to drill down a little bit more on steps 1 or 2. And we're going to be able to put some links in the chat where you can learn a little bit more about this stuff. But just know for now, we're going to touch on each of these a very little bit. And if you want to learn more about any of the stuff that I'm about to say, please ask about it in the Q&A, because I don't want to presume to know what aspect of our work you're most interested in. Well, that's what the Q&A is for. So how do we go about finding these non-voting environmentalists and then turning them into better voters? Well, the first step is identification. And this might sound obvious, but it's an important starting point. We obviously can't talk to all 320 million Americans and find out what their most important issue is, right? Even if we had the time and the money, we still wouldn't be able to reach all of them. We wouldn't even be able to reach 1% of them. So we need to find something that is almost as precise, but much more efficient and possible. And the way to do that is building what's called predictive models. What predictive models do, and I'm about to describe a process that very sophisticated political campaigns now use to target voters as well. So it's not just us. What predictive models do is we poll enormous numbers of people, figure out who lists climate change as their top priority, and then work with data scientists to find other people like them until we feel like we've got a really accurate list of climate first voters. Now, if that went by too quickly, don't worry. The next few slides are going to go into more detail. But the important thing to understand now is that by the end of this identification step, what we are able to do is identify individuals in our voter files. So not demographic groups, but individuals who are really likely to not just care about climate or the environment, but literally list it as their number one priority. And then remember what I said earlier about the public nature of the voter file. Who you vote for is secret, but whether you vote or not is public record. So after we identify millions of individuals who are likely to list climate as their top priority, we don't then need fancy data scientists to help us figure out which of those environmentalists are good at voting and which are bad at voting. That's public record. You could go to City Hall and figure it out. So we can then move into step 2, mobilization, with a list of millions of individuals who we know don't need their minds changed. They don't need their opinions changed. These are people who, like, you shake them awake at night and they're going to scream climate change. Like, they are with us. They're just not voting. And this is a really special moment because at this point, the fact that we at the Environmental Voter Project don't need to educate these people about climate change, don't need to convince them of anything, well, now we can be completely agnostic with our messaging. We don't even need to talk about climate change. We could talk about whatever behavioral people to start voting. We could talk about chocolate chip cookies if that's the best way to get these people to vote. And so what we do is we run hundreds of randomized control trials each year, testing which messages work best with which subgroups of these non-voting environmentalists to get them to do one thing and one thing only, and that is start voting. We work with now over 7,000 volunteers to canvass and call and postcard these voters. We also do direct mail and digital ads to them, all with this proven behavioral science informed messaging. And I'm going to get into it in a little bit later, but we run these randomized control trials not only to figure out what messages work best, but also so that we can prove our impact. Then we move on to step 3. We live behavioral science every day at the Environmental Voter Project. I assume many of you don't, but you can probably still intuitively understand that if you're trying to change people's voting habits, you can't just talk to them once every 2 years when there's a big federal election going on. You need to talk to them all the time. And so we take habit reinforcement really seriously at the Environmental Voter Project. Not only do we work in even years and odd years, not only do we work in federal, state, and local elections and generals and primaries and specials, but we literally work in hundreds of elections each year. We will be active in over 500 elections this year, this calendar year. I kid you not, 500. And that's not because all of them are important for climate policymaking. I freely admit that. But each of those elections is crucially important for changing people's behavior. If you are in the behavior change business, you can't let an intervention opportunity pass you by. And so at the Environmental Voter Project, we will get involved in library trustee elections, school committee races, you name it. Because at the end of the day, the only way to turn a non-voter into a voter is to get them to vote in an election. And so we hate to have any election pass us by. Because ultimately our goal is step 4, and that is to change the electorate. Ultimately, we know that politicians aren't going to lead on climate out of the goodness of their hearts. Nor are they probably going to lead on climate because some silver-tongued lobbyist just managed to convince them that it was a really good idea. No, politicians do what it takes to win elections. Nothing motivates a politician more than the prospect of winning or losing an election. And so they always go where the votes are. And that's why it's our job at the Environmental Voter Project to dramatically increase the number of voters, not non-voters, but voters who care deeply about climate and the environment. because politicians are in the business of collecting votes. And if more and more voters prioritize an issue, politicians better start prioritizing that issue, or they ain't going to be a politician anymore. That's our very simple theory of change. We just need to rely on politicians wanting to win elections. And so we're going to go and make it really hard for them to win elections without leading on climate. All right. I said I'm going to drill down in a little more detail on step 1 and then a teeny bit on step 2. So let's jump into that. How do we build these predictive models? I know I breezed over that. Well, the process starts, as I mentioned, with huge polls, huge surveys. We will poll 10, 11, 12,000 people. Enormous polls, but we can get away with it cost-wise because we're only really asking one question, and that is, what's your number one most important political priority? So let's take the state of Pennsylvania as an example. Let's say we poll 10,000 people in Pennsylvania, and I'm just making this number up. Let's say 1,000 of them come back and they say climate change or clean air or clean water, some environmental issue is their number one priority. Well, we can then find those individuals on the voter file and figure out, okay, well, what do we know about them? What other data is on the voter file? What census data is there about them? And then we start working with data scientists, and the data scientists say, oh, we've found all this behavioral and consumer data about them too. Now, we only use publicly available data, but there's a lot of it out there. And we can start learning a whole lot about these 1,000 people who just said, oh, yeah, climate change is my number one priority. In fact, we can start learning so much about them that we can start trying to find other people like them on the voter file. And we're not talking about just one archetype. We're talking about dozens of archetypes, dozens of types of people who we think will be like these 1,000 people who told us that climate's their number one priority. Maybe there's a bunch of people who live in the suburbs of Philadelphia and bought an electric vehicle last year and subscribed to National Geographic and have 2 kids in the public schools. And we see, oh yeah, a lot of them like climate. Or maybe there's a group of people who live in Lehigh Valley and buy Apple products and do outdoor recreation. Who knows? There are lots of little clusters, but the idea is we use this original data that we get to try to find more and more people like that. And maybe certain data points start popping, start telling us where to look. Maybe we realize that if you're an agricultural or forestry employee in Pennsylvania, you're 11 times more likely to list climate as your top priority than other Pennsylvanians. Or maybe we realize that if you have a new home but no kids, you're 6 times more likely than the average Pennsylvanian to care about environmental issues. Or maybe we realize basketball fans care more about climate than baseball, hockey, or football fans. Now, I know these are weird data points, and that's why they're in here, to try to illustrate that no single data point is predictive on its own. None of these, you can't just say, okay, well, let's go out and get all the basketball fans who just bought a new house. No, it's not that simple. Usually it's clusters of 30 or 40 data points that help us identify these voters. But it's a long iterative process where what we're trying to do is build out from those initial 1,000 people until we've got a pretty good idea of how likely every single Pennsylvanian is in the voter file to not just care about climate and the environment, but literally list it as their number one priority. And then once these data scientists we work with have a pretty good idea of that, they test the assumption and then they retest it. And maybe they realize, oh no, we were wrong about this set of voters and we were wrong about, oh yeah, we should have put more value on that set, until we get to a point where we can literally assign a score from 0 to 100 to every individual voter in the voter file. And that's what you're looking at right here. This is a distribution of every individual voter in the state of Pennsylvania, telling us how likely they are to list climate or the environment as their top priority. And I'm sure it comes as no surprise to many of you, there are millions of Pennsylvanians who have like less than a 30% likelihood of listing climate as their top priority. No surprise there, right? And then there are a whole bunch in this mushy middle, like, man, maybe they could go either way. What we care about is up here. People who have about an 85% likelihood or higher of literally listing climate as their top priority. These are the people we care most about. Because again, we can't talk to every single American and be 100% certain of who lists climate as their top priority. But if we can build highly accurate models and test and retest their accuracy, and then isolate people who at least have an 85% likelihood of listing climate as their top priority, man, that's pretty darn good. That's so darn good that maybe we just want to find these people and make sure that they vote in every darn election we can. So that's what we do. Because once we isolate these people, the first step is we go and look at their public voting histories. Because remember, it's public record whether you vote or not. We isolate the ones who are really likely to list climate as the top priority, but are unlikely to vote, and that's who we target. And just as an example, these are the 42,067 individual registered voters in Philadelphia who we identified last fall as being at least 85% likely to list climate as their number one priority, yet they had not voted for at least 5 years. Most of them had never voted before. These were our targets. Not demographic groups, but individuals. I mean, not to be creepy about it, but like we literally know these people by name and street address. So we can knock on their doors. We can call them. We can send them postcards and mail and digital ads, all with this behavioral science informed messaging to get them to vote. This is how we go about finding these individuals, these millions of individuals who care deeply about climate and the environment, but aren't voting. Now, if you have more questions about how we go about identifying these voters, we can put some information on links in the chat for you. And also, please feel free to ask questions during the Q&A. But the next thing that I just want to touch on is mobilization. So we identify these non-voting environmentalists as individuals by name and street address. And we have 5 ways of mobilizing them. 1 is door-to-door canvassing. 2 is volunteer phone calls. And 3, volunteer postcards. These are all of the things that we work with volunteers on. Additionally, as a staff, we also run digital ad campaigns and direct mail campaigns to these non-voting environmentalists. And here's the really interesting thing. We don't have enough time to go into tremendous detail on this, but I do want to tell you a little bit about our messaging. And again, if you've got questions, we can go into it during the Q&A. We don't talk about climate and the environment. Not because we don't like to. Oh my gosh, we would love to talk about climate and the environment. We're an environmental nonprofit. But remember, our number one goal is just getting these people who already care about climate and the environment but aren't voting to start voting. And what we have discovered, and I use that term very lightly, the truth is we stand on the shoulders of a generation of academic giants who have done behavioral economics and social psychology and behavioral psychology experiments, figuring out how to get people to change their behavior, whether it's getting them to exercise more often or lose weight or get vaccinated or vote. And what we've all come to realize is that the best way to get someone to change their behavior and start voting is not to try to convince them of the importance of voting, which I know is counterintuitive. Instead, it's to treat them not as rational animals, but as social animals. And what we try to do is figure out what kind of person does this non-voting environmentalist want to be, or perhaps more importantly, want to be seen as. Do they want to be thought of as good citizens, good neighbors? Do Do they want to be thought of as cool? Do they want to be thought of as honest? Do they want to be thought of as part of the crowd? Do they not want to feel left out? Do they not want to feel stupid? Do they not want to feel irresponsible? These might sound like soft, mushy concepts, but human beings are almost pathologically social creatures. We are very socially aware, and we're always looking around at our peers to try to figure out what is appropriate behavior and what is inappropriate behavior. And so all of our messaging usually tries to figure out, how do we align the act of voting with the type of person these people want to be? Okay, I realize I've spoken in really broad, generalized, like academic terms. So let me give you some actual examples here. Most people want to be thought of as honest promise keepers. So one of the best ways you can get someone to vote is knock on their door or give them a call and ask them if they intend to vote. And most people will be embarrassed and they'll say yes just to get rid of you. But that's like a trap closing on them, because then we can follow up with them right before the election and say, hey, I just want to remind you, a few months ago, you told one of our volunteers that you were going to vote. And, we know it's important to you to be an honest person who keeps your promises. And Tuesday's your opportunity to follow through on that promise. Well, now we're equating the act of voting with whether that person is an honest person who keeps their promises. And believe me, that's a hell of a lot more powerful than trying to convince someone of the value of their one vote over a denominator of millions. No, that rational cost benefit approach of convincing someone of the power of their vote might make us feel good as creatures of the Enlightenment that we're being so rational, but it rarely gets people to the polls. We also use things as simple as peer pressure. We'll say, hey, did you know last time there was an election, 137 people on your block of Main Street turned out to vote? Or we'll send them letters reminding them that who they vote for is secret, but whether they vote or not is public record. That sends turnout through the roof. These are the types of messages that we use. It's always nonpartisan, but it is also always tested so that we know that they work. So now I'm going to get into some of the ways that we measure our impact and the ways that we can test that these messages work. If you want to learn more about our messaging, we've got webinars, little sort of mini briefings on messages that we found worked, messages that we found did not work, and we'd love to share that with you in the chat. But let's get to our results. Last year, just as an example, we were active in 214 elections across 19 states. Ultimately, we were able to communicate, so not just try to communicate with, but actually communicate with 3.9 million unique individual voters. And remember, we're only targeting people who are already registered to vote. They're highly likely to list climate or the environment as their number one priority. Yet, they're unlikely to vote, which last year meant they were unlikely to vote in a presidential general. We have an incredible group of volunteers who made almost 9 million phone calls, having over 260,000 actual conversations with voters. We also canvassed, sent an enormous number of postcards, and then we as a staff had huge direct mail and digital ad campaigns. Now, what we know is that we reached a whole bunch of people who ended up voting. But that's not good enough for us. What we want to know is, would those people have voted if it weren't for the Environmental Voter Project? Simply knowing that the people we spoke to ended up voting isn't good enough. And it shouldn't be good enough for our volunteers or our donors either. Sure as hell isn't good enough for us. So we run what's called randomized control trials. This allows us to isolate what EVP's sole impact was on turnout. And this is how we do that. Let's take Pennsylvania as an example again. So let's say we identify 500,000 unlikely to vote environmentalists in Pennsylvania. What we do not do is immediately start communicating with all 500,000 of them. Instead, before we talk to a single one of them, we randomly separate them into two groups. A treatment group, sometimes called an intervention group. This is the group that's going to get our messaging, and a control group. That control group gets no messaging from us whatsoever. We set them aside and we never talk to them. This treatment group, which usually has about 80 to 85% of this initial population, they're the ones that we canvass and call and mail and send digital ads to, all with this souped up behavioral science informed messaging. And then the election happens. And a few months later, remember what I said? Now, maybe for the third or fourth time, I'll say, who you vote for is secret, but whether you vote or not is public record. So a few months later, voter files are updated, and we can see how many people voted in our treatment group and compare it to how many people voted in our control group. And remember, they're both filled with these low propensity environmental voters. And so as long as this initial separation process was truly random, and as long as the numbers are big enough that we can prove that the results weren't due to random occurrence, we can prove what's called statistical significance. The benefit of taking this approach is it allows us to prove what our sole impact was while controlling for all other variables. Because let's say it was pouring rain in Pittsburgh and that depressed turnout. Well, there's roughly the same percentage of Pittsburgh residents in our treatment group as there is in our control group. We controlled for that variable. Or let's say the Harris campaign spends $1 billion mobilizing voters talking about the environment. Well, we've controlled for that too. Unless they hack into our system and decide to only talk to people in our treatment group and nobody in our control group, we've controlled for that. That's the benefit of randomly setting aside these control groups. And so, just over the past 4 years alone, we can go back further than that, but just we'll talk about 4 years here. We probably increased turnout in thousands of elections, but probably isn't good enough for us. We want to know with statistical significance. We want to be certain, certainty that could pass peer review. We want to be certain, were we solely responsible for boosting turnout and by how much? And just over the last 4 years, 21 and 2022 and 23 and 24, we have been solely responsible for boosting turnout by as much as 1.8 percentage points in presidential general elections, 3.8 percentage points in other statewide elections, and as much as 5.7 percentage points in local elections. And those might not sound like big numbers to you, but they are everything in politics. Ask Kamala Harris or Donald Trump how big a deal 1.8 percentage points is in a presidential general election, and they'll tell you. We are extraordinarily proud of all of the work that our volunteers have put into getting results like this. That's the first of two ways that we go about measuring our impact. The second is over the long term. Now, as a reminder, whether you vote or not is public record. So when we target these specific non-voting environmentalists, we tag them in our voter files, whether they vote or not. And then we track them over multiple elections to see if their voting history is changing. And we only stop communicating with these non-voting environmentalists when we can no longer call them someone who is likely to not vote. We look at their past voting history and we realize, well, they just vote in every kind of election now. There's no reason to waste time or money mobilizing them. And as of about 7 weeks ago, which is the last time we dropped the needle and made this measurement, we saw that we have now communicated with almost 12.8 million unique low propensity environmental voters. Now, each of these people were highly likely to list climate as their top priority, and they were really awful voters, or else we wouldn't have been talking to them, right? And when we looked at their public voting history about 8 weeks ago, we realized that almost 2.2 million of them had now become such consistent super voters that they had voted in their most recent federal election, their most recent state election, and even their most recent local election. They had become super voters. You could be running for dog catcher and you would look at the voter file and you'd see this person, you'd say, yep, got to go talk to them. They're going to vote. We should probably figure out what issues they care about too. This is the metric of which we are most proud. These 2.2 million super voters. Now, I want to be clear, this is different from the previous metric, the randomized control trial. Unlike the randomized control trial, where we can say we're solely responsible for those results, we can't say that EVP is solely responsible for turning 2.2 million non-voters into super voters, but we're pretty darn responsible. No other organization is active in 200, 300, 400 elections each year, building up these voting habits, even in these low turnout elections like we are. We've been getting great recognition for this. We've been featured in all of these outlets that you see here. People are really excited by our cutting edge blend of data science and behavioral science. And we're very, very fortunate at this particular moment in time when so many people are asking these angst-ridden questions, trying to figure out what went wrong last fall and what should we do going forward. And we at the Environmental Voter Project are lucky that we know what works. We might not have the solutions to every problem that ails us, but we have one proven set of solutions for a really big problem. And that is how to get tens of millions of values-aligned environmentalists off the sidelines and start voting. And so this is how we're meeting the moment in 2025. We have expanded into 2 more states. We are now in these 21 states that you see here. We recently expanded into New Jersey and Michigan. We are targeting over 6 million already registered low propensity environmental voters who are unlikely to vote in this fall's elections. 6 million. Just to give you a sense of some of the more prominent elections that are coming up over the coming months, you can see them here. Primaries and then general elections for gubernatorial and other statewide positions in New Jersey and Virginia. Mayoral elections in Detroit and New Orleans and Atlanta and Boston. Two statewide public service commission seats in Georgia. Some of you might be like rolling your eyes, but no, these are important. Public service commissions regulate utilities in a state, and Georgia is the largest state that has elected public service commissioners. This is crucially important for addressing the climate crisis. And this is just a small number of the hundreds of elections that we're going to be involved in over the next 6-7 months. And yes, we are going to be working every day. And so by the end of this year, we're going to be active in over 500 elections. As I mentioned before, for those of you who are interested in getting involved, our volunteers are going to be phone banking, postcarding, and canvassing. We're also going to be running direct mail and digital ad campaigns as a staff. Just to give you a sense of how many opportunities we offer. Don't worry, we don't expect you to read this teeny font. It's almost just to prove to you how much stuff we've got going on. Just in June, you can go to the Get Involved page on our website and sign up for any number of dozens of phone banks in New York City or Virginia or New Jersey or Arizona. You can sign up to canvass certain places. You can sign up for postcarding orientations. We've got so many opportunities for you to make a difference. And the benefit of all these randomized control trials is we never ask a volunteer to say anything to a voter unless we have proven in a randomized control trial that it actually increases turnout. It's a great opportunity if you want to make a difference. And I kind of know you do, or else you wouldn't be here. You can also go to the Get Involved page right now and sign up. You can sign up right now. It is so easy. You sign up for one of these phone banks, and the first thing will be a training. We won't ask you to do anything until you feel comfortable and well trained to do it. Finally, I'll just say many of you might not be interested in volunteering, or you might be interested, in addition to volunteering, in where to place your political and your environmental donations. And I can tell you, we consistently put over 90% of the donations we receive towards voter identification and mobilization. This is an enormously efficient organization, and we are working now. And so please, I know that many of you are searching for ways to have an impact. I encourage you to go to environmentalvoter.org/donate and make a donation now. You can also make a monthly donation. Spread it out. Now, you can donate as much as you would like to us. We're a 501c4 nonprofit. We don't need to report who our donors are. You can donate as much as you would like. You do not get a tax write-off for it. I'm sorry. That's the downside of supporting very impactful organizations like this. But we will put the funds right into the field to mobilize voters. And I should also say, we will never, ever share your data. We've never done it. We never will. You're not going to give us your information and then all of a sudden start getting texts from a gazillion other places. Or if you do, it won't be because of us. It'll be because of other organizations. So we'll get to the Q&A. I just want to leave you by saying, I know that many of you are worried. I know that many of you are anxious. I know that many of you understand that we need to build political power right now. And I'm here to tell you, you don't have to wait until 2026. You can make an impact right now. We at EVP don't have all the answers to every problem, but we know how to get millions of these non-voting environmentalists into the game. And that is really impactful. And it is something we are doing now, when most organizations aren't talking to voters. So please join us, and thank you so, so much for wanting to learn more about our work. All right. Shannon, do we have any questions?
Yeah. So with the different types of volunteer opportunities that we have, not to mention the staff handled part of the operation, if someone is going to volunteer, what is the most effective option for them? Phone banking, postcarding, canvassing?
Great, great question. So first, let me just say that, oh my God, does messaging always matter? So if you're going to take what I say and just apply it to all organizations, please make sure they're using proven messaging and they can show you randomized control trials like showing that it works. But as far as with the Environmental Voter Project, we like to measure this stuff not just by effectiveness, but also efficiency. So I'll answer the question, but I also want to add a little bit more to it. So by effectiveness, we mean, okay, what intervention has the potential to increase turnout the most? What has the highest ceiling? And by efficiency, we mean, okay, well, whatever you're able to increase turnout, how much money did it cost to get there? Or, excuse me, how many volunteer hours did it take to get there? So, on a scale of effectiveness, the single most effective way to get a non-voter to start voting is still door-to-door canvassing, knocking on their door and having a conversation, one human being to another, in person. But that's not terribly efficient. Some people love to do it. And oh my God, would we love you to help us canvass in places like Philadelphia and Pittsburgh and Atlanta and Northern Virginia, where we're doing canvassing. But it is usually more efficient to do phone banking. Now, a good canvassing operation might be able to boost turnout 3 or 4 percentage points. A good phone banking operation can still boost turnout 1, maybe 1.5 percentage points, so it's not as effective, but it's much, much more efficient. You might be able to talk to 30 or 40 voters in an hour and a half, whereas you're lucky if you talk to like 6 voters in an hour and a half if you're canvassing. Postcarding is probably has the same level of effectiveness as phone banking. It is certainly less efficient. It takes people a long time to write postcards, but talking to strangers on the phone isn't everybody's cup of tea, and we get that. And so some people just prefer doing postcards, even though they are at that lower end of both effectiveness and efficiency. But I do just want to say 2 things here in closing on this particular question. One, layering different levels of outreach is always, always important. And 2, we will never give you as a volunteer something to do unless we have proven in a randomized control trial that it increases turnout. So whatever you do with us, you can rest assured that it's been proven in the past to work.
Thank you, Nathaniel. And as EVP's organizing and field director, that's one of my favorite things about working for EVP. I never feel like I'm wasting your time as a volunteer. All right, I think last question. We've had a few different questions about different policies or laws that are out now. Can you talk about whether we ever talk to voters about those, even when there's a clear environmental stance?
Great, great question. We love getting involved in races that have high environmental stakes, whether they be ballot questions or candidate campaigns or other things. Uh, but for a whole bunch of legal reasons, we cannot get involved in either endorsing candidates or talking about particular issues while mobilizing people to vote. And it, it's not to say that if we did that, we would have to shut down. There are nonprofits that can do that. But if we were to do the work that EVP does and decide that we wanted to start talking about issues, we would probably have to turn into an independent expenditure committee in each of the close to 400 or 500 different jurisdictions we work in. That would mean that we'd probably have to go from spending 5% of our funds each year on overhead to close to 50 or 60%. We would have much less impact on turnout. And ultimately, we kind of feel that the people we're turning from non-voters into voters are gonna vote the so-called right way. And we don't want to waste time trying to persuade them of things that they don't necessarily need to be persuaded of. Or if they do, other good local organizations are going to take up that burden. There are other organizations who are closer to the issues and closer to the jurisdictions who are better placed to do that important work. What we're really good at is juicing turnout of the people who are most aligned with what we care about. And that's an enormous opportunity right now. All right. Thank you all. Thank you all for sharing your evening with us. Thank you for being interested in getting involved with the Environmental Voter Project. I just want to close by saying, please do go to environmentalvoter.org to volunteer for a phone bank or canvassing or postcarding. We will give you proven messaging that we know boosts turnout among these non-voting environmentalists, and we are doing it every day at a moment in time when, let's face it, we are all searching for ways to build political power and make a difference. And if you can't be part of our volunteer efforts right now, support someone who can. Make a donation. This stuff costs money. It just does. And I'm not embarrassed to ask for your financial help because I care about this stuff as much as you do. And I know it's working and we need the funds to make it work. So please donate and donate generously. And we can't wait to see your name coming into my email when you make a donation or to see your face popping up on a phone bank or at a canvas or a postcarding party. So thank you, everybody. Have a great night.